Each year, scientists, researchers, and everyday people make incredible discoveries, helping us to better understand the world around us. So today, here at Unexplained Mysteries, we'll be taking a look at interesting discoveries. Educator helps rescue man lost in Santa Fe National Park for nearly 2 weeks. Hiking is a common pastime, especially in the USA, where there is an abundance of stunning national parks and hiking trails. Something you would never think you would find on a hiking trail would be what Mr Utsey found when he was hiking in Santa Fe National Forest. Hiking with his 2 children, Mr Utsey set out on a normal hike as he had many times before. However, this time was different. They began to hear noises as they were a few miles into the hike. After a few minutes, they realized it was in fact a man calling for help nearby. In total, it took a reported 20 whole minutes of back and forth shouting until they eventually found the man. Just off a steep hillside was a visibly injured and shaken man who continued to tell Utsey and his children that he had been stuck there for 2 weeks. Describing the lost man, Utsey recalled some physical details. His lips were incredibly chapped and bleeding, his tongue had swelled up, and not only was he visibly gaunt, he was barely making sense and was clearly delirious from the time he had spent lost. Leaving all the food and water they had with the man, they began the hike back to get him help. 3 miles later, Mr Utsey informed the relevant authorities, and firefighters from Santa Fe were on the scene within the matter of an hour. Utsey provided the GPS location of where they found the lost man, and the firefighters went to find him. Unfortunately, this is not where the story ends. After 8 hours of continuous searching, the man could not be found, and the search that day was reluctantly called off. Unable to just sit by whilst he knew the lost man was still out there and not in good shape at all, Utsey took it upon himself and set out on the same hike to try and find him. After backtracking to where he was the previous day, Utsey located the man for the second time and immediately called the authorities. Around 4 to 5 hours later, rescue crews were on scene. One member of the rescue crew described the lost man as near the end, and it is reported that he went over a week without any food and managed to survive using his filtered water bottle in the creek nearby. The lost survivor is now recovering successfully in a hospital in Santa Fe. Archaeologists discover medieval woman and child skeletons at the Tower of London. The Tower of London is infamous for being the gruesome resting places of countless miserable souls throughout English history. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vicula lies inside the tower's walls, and is the tragic burial place for Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and other infamously tragic prisoners. The caretakers of the site requested to make the chapel more accessible, but before that was done, the area had to be excavated to ensure no historical relics or artifacts would be destroyed. Alfred Hawkins, a member of the Historic Royal Palaces blog, stated that archaeologists found 2 fully complete skeletal remains of medieval humans. Analysis of the bones revealed it to be the skeleton of a grown woman and child. It is believed that they were lower-class commoners or even destitute peasants that were most likely the tower's caretakers of sorts during the Middle Ages and probably lived within its walls. The bones were dated back between 1450 and 1550, a period in English history with the War of the Roses, the unforgettable reign of Henry VIII, and the cruel, unforgiving reign of his daughter Mary I, otherwise known as Bloody Mary. For the Protestants, she burnt at the stake. The skeletons were found in typical Christian burial fashion, with their feet pointing east and placed on their backs. Nails were found around the skeleton of the grown woman, which implies she was buried in a wooden coffin that rotted away with time. The child, on the unfortunate end, seems to have been merely wrapped in blankets and placed into the earth. No burial trinkets were uncovered near them, and after being checked over by an osteoarchaeologist, they found that the woman was between the age of 35 to 45, whereas the child was no older than 7 years old. Fortunately, neither child nor woman seemed to suffer from any grievous harm. Their deaths were not violent, and thus they were not executed prisoners of the dreaded tower, but instead seemed to have passed away from an illness. The woman most likely had severe lower back pain. Hawkins further said, "Their growth shows not a comfortable life, but one which is typical of the period in which they lived." The finding is exciting because these are the very first skeletal remains found at the tower since the 1970s. The reason why this discovery is so mind-blowing is that whilst historians always assumed there might be complete burials on site, records from the period claimed that burials occurred elsewhere. As far as everyone was concerned, before this finding, no actual burials occurred at the tower apart from those taken to be buried in the chapel. The Tower of London has always been a drastically dramatic location, abundant with stories of woeful lovers such as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, executed advisors such as Thomas More, who was King Henry VIII's Lord Chamberlain until the king had him killed, and significant figures such as Queen Elizabeth I before she was crowned. Sir Walter Raleigh and the mythical princes of the Tower were imprisoned there for respective amounts of time, though in the case of the princes, the popular leading theory is that Richard III had the boy's life ended after he took the throne. 2 sets of bones were uncovered under the tower's stairs, however they have never been proven to belong to the young princes. The tower has existed for almost an entire millennium, and in that time has obtained an amazing amount of history. Hawkins explains the intimacy of the discovery. Often, an archaeological excavation and the information you gain from it feels fairly impersonal, uncovering a Norman ditch here, a Tudor tile there. All of these physical remains enable us to create an image of the past, but the individual history of the people who lived in these periods can sometimes be elusive. This is why the archaeological excavation of human remains is so important. It allows us to examine the way in which people lived and died in our palaces. Archaeologists uncover secret passage to the Underworld at Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan. The antique city of Teotihuacan is the subject of much curiosity, especially now that an underground tunnel was uncovered by archaeologists underneath the mystical Pyramid of the Moon. It is believed that the tunnel symbolizes the Aztec passage to the Underworld. In 300 BCE, the people of Mesoamerica built the great city as they expanded their settlements. At its prime, more than 125,000 people lived in Teotihuacan. At the time, it was the 6th largest city in the entire ancient world. Robert Cowgill, an archaeologist at the University of Arizona, has stated that it was the largest city anywhere in the Western Hemisphere before the 1400s. It had thousands of residential compounds and scores of pyramid temples comparable to the largest pyramids of Egypt. It is unknown who built the city in its entirety. Teotihuacan is older than the Aztec people by an estimated entire millennium. There is evidence that a variety of cultures resided in the city through the centuries, including the Mayans, who influenced much of the architecture. Which culture or civilization created Teotihuacan cannot be confirmed, at least not with the limited evidence we have. The name itself comes from the Aztec word that means birthplace of the gods. However, Mayan hieroglyphs recognize the city as Pu, place of reeds. The city was in ruins when the Aztecs claimed it as their own, abandoned and forlorn for at least half a century, if not longer. Scholars are conflicted about what could have happened to the city. Some believe that Teotihuacan was abruptly attacked, its downfall resulting in a brutal siege by enemy forces. Other scholars argue that there is evidence that suggests a civil uprising occurred due to some unforeseen ecological catastrophe, such as famine, with the ruling class being overthrown. Another theory is that some natural disaster caused a vast population to decline and made survivors move away. There is residual proof of various buildings in Teotihuacan having been burnt. The theory of enemy civilizations ransacking the city is widely accepted by scholars nowadays, though. However, the only structures with evidence of having been burnt are the ones believed to have housed the ruling class, coming full circle and suggesting a social revolt. The Pyramid of the Moon was traced back to between 100 and 450 AD, and was used for animal and human sacrifice, though it additionally served as a burial ground for the victims of sacrifice. An altar resided in the pyramid dedicated to the great goddess of Teotihuacan. Dr. Veronica Ortega, an archaeologist, explained in the explorations carried out at the end of the 1980s, through tunnels excavated in the body of the pyramid, archaeologists Ruben Cabrera and Saburo Sugiyama found skeletons of individuals with cranial deformation. The news of this great tunnel, symbolic of the descent into the underworld meant for the victims of human sacrifice, makes us yearn for more knowledge that may never come to us, but is fascinating to consider. It is unknown whether the tunnel was added by the Aztecs or if it had already been there before them. Perhaps someday we will finally find out. A vampire's remains were found 30 years ago. DNA reveals who he was. Some archaeological finds only begin to make sense much after their initial discoveries, as we are able to apply new technologies in the quest to understand the past. The mysterious remains found in Griswold, Connecticut, are one such case. In 1990, some children playing on the outskirts of the town stumbled across a long-forgotten family cemetery that dated back to the 19th century. There were 4 graves still intact, and these were immediately exhumed for study by archaeologists. However, the 4th grave is what caught their eye. The body had been arranged with the skull and femurs placed into a skull and crossbones pattern on top of the other bones, indicating that the man had been suspected of being a vampire in life, and his bones had been rearranged sometime after his burial to prevent him from leaving his grave and supposedly terrorizing the townspeople. Although the only identifying information on the grave was JB55, spelled out in small nails on the lid, likely indicating initials and age at death, researchers were able to conclude that this supposed vampire was a labourer who had indeed died at around 55 years old, probably from tuberculosis. It was not until July 2019 when a team of scientists announced the results of a DNA test on the vampire that the man's identity was revealed. The DNA was matched to the Barber family, and the man was determined to be John Barber. Barber was likely a victim of the New England vampire panic in the 19th century, when breakouts of tuberculosis were frequently thought to be spread by vampires. The only way to determine if a suspected victim of tuberculosis was indeed one of the vampires was to dig up the grave and look for signs, such as inexplicable preservation of the body, a bloated abdomen, or apparent growth of the hair and nails. We now know that these are common signs of decomposition in improperly preserved bodies, but the townspeople of John Barber's time believed that it confirmed that he was a vampire responsible for the spread of consumption in the town. They removed his head and crossed his femurs over his chest, broke open his ribs, and removed what was left of his decomposing organs, which they then cremated to feed his supposed victims to cure them of his curse. Luckily for John Barber, we now understand the science behind death and disease, and are able to give him the proper, respectful burial that he deserves. But what do you make of these recent discoveries? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comment section below and help us by growing this community while working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.